It began after a tragedy that changed everything. A storm, a crash, and in one cruel moment, Jack Carter lost his wife, while his little girl, Emily, lost her leg. Months later, hoping for a new beginning, the war veteran and his loyal dog, Rex, walked Emily into a new school, believing time and love could heal what fate had taken. But one quiet afternoon, when Jack arrived at the school, what he saw froze him in place. His daughter standing in the corner of the classroom, trembling on her crutches, surrounded by laughter that cut deeper than any wound he'd ever carried. Emily burst into tears, her voice shaking as she whispered, "Daddy, I don't want to go to school anymore." In that moment, Jack made a silent vow. He would not let his child be broken again. Stay with us until the end to see how a father's love and a dog's loyalty turned pain into justice. And if you believe that no child should ever face cruelty alone, hit subscribe to join us for the next story. Wishing you peace and kindness wherever you are today. Morning light spilled gently over the small town of Willow Ridge, Montana, where the mountains sat quiet beneath a pale winter sky. The air was thin and sharp, filled with the smell of pine and the promise of a fragile beginning. Down a gravel road at the edge of town stood a modest wooden house, its porch lined with boots, old dog toys, and a single metal crutch resting by the door. Inside, a man stirred his coffee with the slow precision of someone who had lived long enough to understand that peace never comes easily. His name was Jack Carter, 42 years old, a former soldier whose posture still carried the discipline of years in uniform. His hair had begun to gray at the temples, his face weathered yet kind, the kind of face that bore both strength and grief. Across from him sat Emily, his 8-year-old daughter, small and pale, her blonde hair tied loosely behind her neck, the hem of her dress brushing lightly against a prosthetic leg of polished metal. And lying at her feet was Rex, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a black saddle across his back and tan fur on his chest and legs, his amber eyes never leaving the little girl's side. They had lived quietly since the accident, the one that stole Jack's wife and took his little girl's leg. 3 souls bound not only by what they had lost, but by the unspoken need to protect whatever was left. The first morning at her new school came with a silence heavier than words. Jack stood by the truck, adjusting Emily's backpack while she balanced carefully on her crutches. The prosthetic leg made a faint rhythmic click each time she shifted her weight, a sound she despised but could never escape. Rex sat beside them, tail still, eyes alert, as though understanding the gravity of this small moment. "You'll be fine, sweetheart," Jack said softly, his voice low and warm. Emily nodded without looking up. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her crutch as if holding on to courage itself. As they reached the gate of Willow Ridge Elementary, children were already running, shouting, their laughter bright and unbroken. The contrast made Emily's heart sink. Jack bent down, brushed a loose strand of hair from her forehead, and gave a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Rex wagged his tail once and let out a short, gentle bark, the kind that sounded like a promise. Jack watched as his daughter moved slowly through the crowd, the faint click-click of her steps fading into the noise of the playground. He told himself she would be okay. He wanted to believe it. Inside the classroom, sunlight streaked through tall windows onto rows of small desks. Emily took a seat in the last row, hoping invisibility might be enough to survive the day. Her blue eyes darted around the room, catching glances from curious faces before quickly looking down. That was when she noticed a boy at the next desk, thin, slightly awkward, with brown hair that fell over a pair of round glasses. Noah. He smiled at her, shy but genuine, and when her pencil rolled off the edge of the desk, he picked it up without a word. It was a small kindness, but it warmed her chest more than she expected. The teacher, Ms. Heller, stood at the front, mid-40s, her expression perpetually distracted as if she was already tired of the day before it began. She called attendance in a monotone voice, never once meeting Emily's eyes. When Emily rose to place her books on the shelf, the sound of her prosthetic leg echoed across the floor, a crisp, metallic click. A few heads turned, some whispered. By the time she sat down again, she could feel the first seeds of mockery sprouting in the room. Recess came, and the whispers grew louder. 2 children, Jason, tall for his age, with a cocky smirk, and Ashley, whose blonde ponytail swung like a metronome of arrogance, started mimicking the sound of her steps. "Click, click, robot girl," Jason sang as Emily passed by. The laughter that followed was quick and cruel. Emily froze, cheeks burning, unsure whether to run or stand her ground. Rex wasn't there to defend her this time, only the stares of others, the careless snickers, and the teacher's distant voice calling for order without conviction. Noah watched from the bench, his small hands clenching around his lunchbox. Later, when the bell rang, he slipped a folded note into her notebook. It read, "Don't be sad. You're stronger than they know." She smiled faintly, though tears threatened to betray her. It was the first friendly gesture she had received in weeks. That evening, Jack noticed something. A tear in her pants, a faint bruise on her knee, and a drop of dried blood on the edge of her metal limb. "Did you fall, kiddo?" he asked gently. Emily hesitated, then nodded. "Just tripped on the ramp." Her voice was small, rehearsed. Jack didn't press, but Rex did. The dog sniffed the air, tail stiff, letting out a low, uneasy growl. Jack reached down, patting Rex's head, though the unease in his chest mirrored the dog's instincts. That night, long after Emily had gone to bed, Jack sat by the window, watching the quiet street under the dim porch light. He thought of the battlefield and how sometimes the most dangerous fights were the ones you didn't see. When he finally turned off the lamp, Rex had already stationed himself by Emily's door, his amber eyes open, guarding her dreams. The next morning, Emily's smile was thinner. She said she was fine. Jack didn't believe her. As they reached the school, he watched her walk away, her little figure swallowed by the crowd, Rex whining softly in the truck as if sensing the storm ahead. Jack stayed longer than usual, engine running, his eyes following the classroom window. For a few minutes, everything seemed normal. The movement of pencils, the flutter of paper, the routine of childhood. Then he noticed the teacher's chair was empty. And through the glass, something didn't look right. Inside, the scene unfolded in quiet cruelty. Emily stood near the back corner, her crutches slightly askew, surrounded by Jason and two others. They had lifted pieces of cardboard from a recycling bin and arranged them around her like a makeshift wall. "Let's see if the robot can move now," Jason sneered. Laughter erupted. Ashley snapped a picture with her phone, her giggles slicing through Emily's fragile composure. Noah sat frozen at his desk, torn between fear and the urge to speak. Ms. Heller stood at the door, pretending to rearrange papers, pretending not to see. Emily's throat tightened. Her hands trembled as she tried to steady herself on the crutches, the metal clicking softly against the floor like a cry for help no one wanted to hear. Outside the classroom, Jack's pulse quickened. He could hear the faint echoes, the laughter, the scraping of chairs. Then, through the small glass window, he saw it. His daughter, pressed into the corner, trembling on her crutches, surrounded by children jeering like a pack that had forgotten mercy. The cardboard barrier rose between her and the rest of the world, and for a split second, he couldn't move. The memory of sirens from the night of the accident came rushing back, the helplessness, the screaming, the unbearable truth of losing something you love. But this time, he didn't freeze. This time, he moved. Rex, sensing the shift, growled deep in his throat. Jack's hand slammed against the door. The laughter stopped. Every head turned. The room fell into stunned silence as the tall figure of a man in an olive-green jacket stepped forward, eyes burning with a fury that was half rage, half heartbreak. He crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to one knee beside his daughter. Emily looked up, tears streaking her pale cheeks, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Daddy, I don't want to go to school anymore." The words pierced him deeper than any wound he'd carried from war. Jack's arms wrapped around her, lifting her gently, as if the world might crumble if he let her fall again. No one spoke. The children stared, faces pale, guilt dawning too late. Even Ms. Heller's lips parted, but no sound came out. Rex trotted in quietly, tail lowered, his gaze fixed on Emily, as though guarding her from the invisible threat of shame. Jack said nothing more. His expression was calm, but his silence held the weight of a storm gathering strength. He turned, holding Emily close, and walked out of the classroom. The sound of Rex's claws against the tile floor echoed behind him, steady and unwavering. In the hallway, the world outside was just as it had been, sunlight through glass, footsteps in the distance, but for Jack, everything had shifted. The faint metallic click of Emily's prosthetic leg was no longer a sound of pain. It was a reminder, a rhythm that beat in time with his resolve. By the time they reached the door, his jaw was set, his eyes dark with quiet determination. He didn't raise his voice, didn't look back, but in that silence lay a promise. No one would ever make his daughter feel small again. He carried her across the parking lot as Rex followed close behind, the leash hanging loose from his hand. The wind brushed through the pine trees, scattering the last of the autumn leaves across the ground. Emily buried her face into his shoulder, her sobs muffled against the fabric of his jacket. Jack said nothing. He didn't need to. The battle ahead would not be fought with anger, but with truth. And as the truck door closed behind them, Rex climbed in, settling beside Emily, his warm body pressed protectively against her side. The engine started, the tires rolled forward, and the reflection of the school grew smaller in the mirror until it vanished entirely. Jack's face was unreadable as he drove through the quiet streets of Willow Ridge, but behind that silence was a vow forming, clear, steady, unshakable. He had been a soldier long enough to know that some wars never end, they only change form. And now, his battleground was not a desert or a foreign city. It was a classroom, a place that was supposed to keep his daughter safe. He would fight for that, for her, for every child who stood trembling in the corner while the world looked away. The day might have ended in silence, but something powerful had begun. A father's quiet war for justice. The morning after the confrontation hung heavy over the Carter home. The air outside Willow Ridge carried a brittle stillness, as if the entire town had turned its face away from something it didn't want to see. Jack stood by the kitchen window, staring into the yard where frost covered the grass like thin glass. His coffee had gone cold in his hands. Across the room, Emily sat silently at the table, tracing circles on the rim of her cereal bowl, her eyes still swollen from the day before. Rex lay beside her chair, his head resting on his paws, watching her with the patience of an old soldier who understood pain without needing words. There were no discussions about returning to school, no arguments or pleas, just a fragile quietness that filled every corner of the house. When Emily finally whispered, "Do I have to go back?" Jack's answer was simple and firm. Not yet. He wasn't sure what came next, but he knew it couldn't be silence. He had seen too much in life to let cruelty hide behind closed doors again. Later that morning, Jack parked his truck in front of Willow Ridge Elementary. His jaw clenched as he walked into the administrative building. The principal's office smelled faintly of dust and polished wood. Behind the desk sat Principal Everett, a man in his early 50s with a smooth voice and a carefully neutral smile. His suit was immaculate, his tie centered perfectly, the type of man who seemed to value order over truth. Jack spoke calmly at first, his voice low but steady, recounting what he had seen. He handed over a written complaint, each word precise. Principal Everett nodded slowly, offering platitudes about deep regret and the importance of every student's well-being. But as Jack's voice deepened, describing how Emily had been surrounded, humiliated, trembling on her crutches while adults looked away, the principal's tone changed. He folded his hands, gave a sympathetic sigh, and said the words that made Jack's blood run cold. "I understand, Mr. Carter, but without proper evidence, our options are limited. We don't want to escalate this unnecessarily. It could reflect poorly on the school and the children involved." For a long moment, Jack just looked at him, the kind of look that came from battlefields where men decided whether to act or turn away. He thanked him curtly, turned on his heel, and walked out. But inside, something had hardened into resolve. That night, the house was dim except for the warm glow of a single lamp on the workbench. Jack sat with Rex beside him, the faint hum of a soldering tool breaking the silence. The dog watched as Jack adjusted a small device, a micro-camera, no larger than a coin, its lens glinting under the light. Jack had used equipment like this before, though never in a classroom. "You ready for another mission, old friend?" he murmured. Rex lifted his head, ears twitching, as if answering yes. Jack smiled faintly, attached the tiny, camera to Rex's collar, and tested the feed on his phone. The image flickered into focus. The wooden floor, the kitchen table, Emily's backpack. He exhaled slowly. "We'll get them this time," he whispered. There was no bitterness in his voice, only quiet determination. Emily didn't know about the plan. She had gone to bed early, curled beneath her blanket, clutching the stuffed bear her mother had once given her. Jack looked in on her before turning off the light, brushing a hand gently over her hair. He wanted to promise her safety, but he had learned that promises meant nothing without action. The next day, Rex trotted beside Emily as she entered school. The principal had reluctantly allowed the service dog's presence, citing emotional support reasons. Students whispered and stared, but Emily walked forward with her chin slightly higher than before. The metallic rhythm of her steps, click, click, mingled with the sound of Rex's claws against the tile floor. It wasn't courage that held her up, not yet. It was trust. Jack waited outside, leaning against the truck, pretending to read a newspaper while his eyes followed the signal on his phone. Through the tiny lens, he saw snippets of ordinary school life. Desks, backpacks, the scrape of chairs, until the calm began to fracture. In the afternoon, during group work, Jason made his move. Emily had been standing to reach the top shelf when he deliberately brushed past her, sending one of her crutches clattering to the ground. The room filled with snickers. Emily stumbled, trying to steady herself on one leg. Ms. Heller glanced up from her papers, but said nothing. Rex's ears perked in the hallway. He let out a low, uneasy whine. Through the camera feed, Jack watched the moment unfold. Jason's smug grin, Ashley's whisper, Emily's silent struggle. Every muscle in Jack's body tightened. He could almost hear her breathing, the sharp intake of air before she fell. When Jason's elbow accidentally hit her remaining crutch, Emily collapsed. Gasps filled the room. Ms. Heller's eyes flicked toward the fallen girl, but she didn't move. She only said, "Pick her up and stop fooling around." Jack's hand clenched around the phone, his knuckles white. Rex barked sharply from the hall, the sound echoing down the corridor. Students jumped in surprise. Ms. Heller frowned, stepping toward the door, and that was when Jack entered. The door swung open with a force that made the room fall silent. The sight of him, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the same olive-green field jacket he'd worn in war, made every student freeze. Rex padded in beside him, hackles raised but controlled, his amber eyes locked on Jason. Jack's gaze swept the room, cold and steady. Then, in a voice low enough to command attention yet heavy with restrained fury, he said, "Which one of you thinks pain is a joke?" The words hung in the air like thunder that hadn't yet broken. No one moved. Emily, still on the floor, looked up through tears that blurred her vision. She reached for Rex, who immediately pressed his head against her shoulder, whining softly. Jack crouched beside her, his hand brushing the hair from her face. His voice softened to something only she could hear. "You don't have to stay quiet to be accepted, Emily. Not anymore." Outside the classroom, footsteps approached, Principal Everett and Ms. Heller, their faces a mix of irritation and unease. "Mr. Carter," Everett began, his tone strained, "you can't just—" But Jack stood up slowly, cutting him off with the calm of a man who no longer feared consequence. "Actually, I can," he said, pulling his phone from his pocket. With one swipe, the projection from his screen appeared on the classroom's smartboard. The footage from Rex's camera filled the room. Jason knocking the crutch, the laughter, Emily's fall, and Ms. Heller standing idly by. Every second of cruelty laid bare under fluorescent light, the children's faces drained of color. Ms. Heller took a step back, her lips parting in disbelief. Principal Everett stammered something about context and misunderstanding, but the evidence was too clear. The truth had weight now, undeniable and heavy. Then came a voice from the back, quiet at first, trembling but resolute. I have something too," Noah said, rising from his seat. His small hands clutched a phone, his face pale but determined. He stepped forward, thumb shaking as he opened his video. The screen showed Ms. Heller in the same classroom corner, arms folded, watching as Jason mocked Emily, and doing nothing. Gasps rippled through the room. The teacher's composure cracked, color drained from her cheeks. Noah's voice was soft but firm. She saw everything. She didn't stop them. The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick with realization. Jack looked at the boy, his expression softening. "That took courage," he said quietly. Noah nodded, eyes glistening. Jason stood frozen. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by the fragile confusion of a child realizing he had crossed a line that couldn't be erased. His voice quivered when he spoke. I'm sorry." Jack regarded him for a long moment before answering. His tone was calm, but each word carried the weight of years lived and lessons learned. "The strongest people aren't the ones who never fall, son. They're the ones who admit when they're wrong and choose to protect those who can't protect themselves." Jason lowered his head and the room remained still. The principal finally found his voice again, muttering about temporary suspension and necessary review. Jack didn't respond. He knelt again beside Emily, helped her to her feet, and guided her out the door while Rex stayed close, a living wall of protection between her and the stairs. As they passed Noah's desk, the boy looked up. Emily managed a faint, grateful smile through her tears. He smiled back, though his eyes were red. By late afternoon, word had spread through the school like wildfire. Parents called the office, reporters lingered at the gates, and the district superintendent was informed within hours. Ms. Heller was placed under investigation, her classroom reassigned. Jason and the others were suspended. But inside the Carter household, none of that mattered yet. What mattered was the quiet evening light streaming through the windows, the slow rhythm of Emily's breathing as she rested against the couch, and Rex lying faithfully by her side. Jack sat in his armchair, exhaustion settling deep into his bones, but for the first time in months, his chest felt lighter. The world had seen what it tried to ignore, and maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of change. The next morning, a letter arrived from the school board acknowledging the incident and commending Rex for his remarkable service and protective instincts. Jack read it aloud with a faint smile. Emily reached down and wrapped her small arms around Rex's neck, whispering, "Good boy." The dog thumped his tail softly against the floor, his eyes half closed, content in the warmth of their shared victory. Jack folded the letter and placed it on the table without a word. Outside, the frost had begun to melt, revealing green beneath the white. For the first time in a long while, Willowridge seemed a little less cold. A week passed before Emily found the courage to look at her school uniform again. The mornings in Willowridge had grown gentler, the frost giving way to mist, and the mist softening into sunlight. But inside the Carter house, the air remained still, the kind of quiet that settles after a storm but hasn't yet found peace. Jack moved about the kitchen with deliberate calm, fixing breakfast she barely touched, his every word soft, careful, as though he feared even his voice might fracture her fragile calm. Rex stayed close at her feet, head resting on her shoe, amber eyes following every tremor of her hand. Sometimes Emily would reach down and run her fingers through his fur, finding comfort in the warmth of a creature who asked for nothing in return. When she looked up at her father, she often found his gaze already on her, full of patience, full of waiting. "When you're ready," he would say, never pushing, never pleading. But readiness is a complicated thing for a child who has learned that laughter can wound. News traveled fast in small towns. By midweek, the story had spread beyond Willowridge's borders. War veteran and his dog expose bullying at local school. People talked in hushed admiration at the diner, in the post office line, even at the church steps on Sunday. Some called Jack a hero, others a troublemaker, but everyone knew his name now. It wasn't fame he sought, yet the attention felt like vindication for something much deeper, the silent truth that had been ignored too long. Emily heard the whispers too. When the paper arrived, she traced her finger over the printed headline, stopping at the photo of Rex sitting tall beside her. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. "They know what happened," she said softly. Jack nodded. "They do," he replied, "and they know you're brave." But bravery, Emily thought, didn't feel like standing tall. It felt like standing at all. The district's investigation was swift. Within days, Ms. Heller was suspended for negligence. The official statement used words like failure of duty and lack of supervision that sounded sterile compared to the truth. Jack attended the hearing quietly, Emily's hand in his, saying little but watching everything. Across the table, Ms. Heller avoided his eyes, her expression unreadable beneath the weight of consequences she could no longer outrun. When the verdict was announced, Jack didn't feel triumph, just closure, a door closing on something that had gone too far. A few seats away sat the new teacher, Ms. Clara Monroe, in her early 30s, her auburn hair tied back loosely, eyes soft but alert behind thin-framed glasses. She wore a cardigan the color of wheat and carried herself with an air of calm authority. When she approached Jack after the meeting, her voice was quiet but firm. "I'm sorry for what your daughter went through," she said. "I can't erase what happened, but I promise things will be different." Jack studied her face for a moment and nodded. There was something steady in her gaze, something that didn't flinch. At home, Rex had become Emily's shadow. Wherever she moved, he was there, lying beside her bed, sitting by her chair, padding softly down the hall as she practiced walking again on her prosthetic leg. Some nights, when nightmares brought back echoes of laughter and shame, she would wake to find Rex's muzzle resting gently on her blanket, a low rumble in his chest that sounded like comfort. Jack watched it all from the doorway, the quiet bond between child and dog, and felt gratitude so deep it almost hurt. On the morning Emily finally said, "I think I want to go back." Jack only nodded, though his throat tightened. "Then we'll go together," he said. The day Emily returned to school, the sun broke through the clouds as if waiting for that moment. The front gates of Willow Ridge stood open, the chatter of children filling the air, but this time it sounded different. There was curiosity, yes, but no cruelty in their tones. Emily walked slowly, the metallic rhythm of her steps, click, click, blending with the sound of her father's boots and Rex's paws. For a moment the three of them stood at the edge of the playground. Jack bent down and straightened her collar, his hand trembling slightly. "You've got this," he whispered. She nodded, swallowing hard, and took her first steps inside. No one laughed, no one whispered. Instead, as she passed, some children stepped aside, some smiled awkwardly, and near the classroom door stood Noah, waiting with his backpack slung too big for his small frame. "Hey," he said simply. "Hey," she replied. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Inside, Ms. Monroe greeted her warmly, the tone of her voice carrying both professionalism and genuine kindness. "Welcome back, Emily. We missed you," she said. And though Emily knew it wasn't entirely true, she appreciated the sentiment. The classroom itself felt changed, brighter somehow, lighter, as if the very air refused to hold the tension of the past. Noah had saved her a seat beside him, and when she sat, he slid a folded piece of paper across the desk. Inside, written in small, careful letters, was the message, "Glad you're back." She smiled and later slipped him a letter of her own, handwritten the night before on a torn page from her sketchbook. It read, "You're the reason I could come back." Noah didn't say anything after reading it. He just smiled, that small, crooked smile that said more than words could. At lunchtime, something unexpected happened. Jason, the boy who had once mocked her, approached. His shoulders were hunched, his eyes uncertain. In his hand was a small silver necklace, simple, with a thin pendant engraved with the words, "Stay strong." He stopped a few steps away and held it out. "It's for you," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Emily hesitated, unsure, then accepted it quietly. For a brief moment the world seemed to pause, the distance between cruelty and remorse bridged by a single act of humility. Jason didn't ask for forgiveness, and she didn't offer it aloud. But in the silence between them, something human passed, fragile but real. From his spot near the door, Jack witnessed the exchange, his chest tightening not with anger, but with something that felt like peace. As the days went on, Willow Ridge began to change. The laughter in the halls softened. Children seemed to choose their words more carefully. The principal, perhaps out of conscience or pressure, introduced new programs about kindness and empathy. But the most meaningful change came when Rex returned to the school, not as a guardian this time, but as part of a new initiative Ms. Monroe proposed. The district approved him as a therapy dog, a calming presence for students who struggled with fear, anxiety, or loneliness. His schedule became a familiar rhythm, mornings in the reading corner, afternoons in the counselor's office, quiet moments where his presence alone seemed to steady young hearts. When Emily saw him lying peacefully beside a nervous first grader, his eyes half closed in patient understanding, she realized that healing wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever been afraid to stand alone. Spring came early that year. The snow melted from the edges of the schoolyard, and the grass returned, patchy but stubborn. One afternoon, the school held its annual My Hero presentation, a chance for students to speak about someone who inspired them. Jack attended quietly, sitting in the back row, hat in his hands. The stage curtains opened, revealing Emily in her polka-dot dress and silver crutches gleaming under the lights. Her voice trembled at first, but grew steadier with each word. "My hero doesn't wear a cape," she began. "He wears an old army jacket and smells like coffee and pine." A ripple of soft laughter passed through the room. "He taught me that kindness is stronger than anger, and that standing up for what's right isn't about being the loudest. It's about being brave enough to care." She paused, her eyes finding Jack's. "And I have another hero," she added, turning toward Rex, who sat beside the stage with a small vest labeled Therapy Dog. "He reminds me that love can heal more than medicine ever could." Jack lowered his head, tears blurring his vision. He wasn't a man who cried easily, but the sound of his daughter's voice, clear, steady, full of light, undid something inside him. Around him, people wiped their eyes. Ms. Monroe smiled from the wings, Noah clapped softly in the front row, and even Jason's eyes were glistening. When Emily finished, the applause that filled the hall wasn't loud but sincere, the kind that carried gratitude rather than noise. Jack rose slowly, pride swelling in his chest. For once, the ache of loss was replaced by something gentler, a sense that maybe, after all the pain, they had found their way back to the light. That evening, the three of them, Jack, Emily, and Rex, walked together through the open field behind the school. The air was golden with the fading sun, and the wind carried the faint scent of wildflowers. Emily walked without hurry, her prosthetic leg making its soft, familiar click-click against the grass. Beside her, Rex bounded ahead, then circled back, playful and free. Jack watched them, hands in his pockets, his heart steady for the first time in a long while. As Emily laughed, chasing after Rex, the sound of her joy rose into the evening, the sound of a child who had found her place again. And when the last light slipped behind the hills, Jack closed his eyes and listened to the rhythm of her steps, the echo of her laughter, and the steady heartbeat of hope returning to a town that had once turned away. Some stories don't end with victory or justice written on paper. Some end in something quieter, something purer, a girl standing tall, a father smiling in the dusk, and a loyal dog running free across the grass. In the gentle chorus of it all, there was only one sound that mattered, the soft, steady click-click of a life moving forward. Sometimes, the quietest acts of love are the ones that leave the deepest mark. A father's steady hand, a child's fragile courage, a dog's silent loyalty. They remind us that compassion doesn't always speak in grand gestures. It lives in the spaces between words, in the choices we make when no one is watching. Somewhere out there, someone is carrying another's burden, healing a wound no one else can see, or standing guard in the dark so others can sleep in peace. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share what it made you feel in the comments below, and subscribe to join us for more stories of kindness and courage. May God bless you, and may you always find warmth in the quiet strength of those who care without asking for anything in return.